record. All right, welcome everybody. This is Martha Barbone. I'm currently the interim director of operations for N.A.P.S, which is now the National Association of Peer Supporters. And I'm so pleased today to bring you this webinar. It's actually the 43rd webinar in a series of webinars, and all of them from 11 to 43, with a couple exceptions, are available on the N.A.P.S website for anyone to view. Let's see here. Still admitting people. We always say that material presented is the view of those presenting, and N.A.P.S is bringing this to you. It's not necessarily the views of all of N.A.P.S. And we are recording this. And in the recording, the chat will not show up, but we get a copy of the chat. If for some reason, if you want to change your name so people don't know you, please feel free to do that. You can do that. If you go to participants and you go by your name, you can change your name if you want to. And let's see here. Again, please mute your device and turn the cameras off with as many people as we're going to have. It's just going to be really hard with our signal, and we want everybody to be able to fully see their screen. If you don't know where that is, there's usually a mute and a unmute and start and stop video. On my screen, it's usually the bottom left. We're also use the chat feature. Again, across that toolbar, you can go to chat. And in the chat, you can see you can send a message to everyone, or you can send a message to any single person that's in the room as well. Just so you know, for transparency, the host gets the whole chat, even if you private chatted. Not that I use that to look at or anything, but I actually didn't ever know that till recently. And I just think it's important people know that when you private chat in Zoom, the host gets the whole chat.
5 minutes ago by Cassie.
Our webinars through N.A.P.S are free for everybody to view. If you want a certificate to use for continuing education, those requirements vary in every state. What we'll do if you are a member and you want a certificate, you email membership@inaops.org. I will send you a short quiz, and after you take the quiz, I will send you a certificate for 1.5 contact hours for today's webinar. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm going to turn this over to my friends and colleagues, Caroline and Sean from the Western Mass Recovery Learning Community, and they're going to take it from here.
Thank you so much, Martha, and welcome to everybody that's joining us today. Yeah, and if y'all could just keep the mute on your from your computers, that would help us just to get out what we're going to get out today. Really grateful to have a lot of y'all here from maybe all over the country. So yeah, we wanted to start off our webinar by sharing a little bit about ourselves and like why we do this work, why you might listen to us, I suppose, for this webinar. So we'll get more into all the specifics of this approach, but part of the alternative to suicide approach is being vulnerable. And so we're going to share a bit about our stories to begin with. But yeah, we are coming to you from Holyoke, Massachusetts. We are sharing a space here. I just want to acknowledge that. We're in some really wild times with COVID-19 still playing a big role in how we're socializing or not. Caroline and I are kind of in a pod of a sense, like we, along with the people we live with, you know, we've we're in each other's space a lot. So that's why we're sharing in the same screen. I'm grateful when I've been able to take space from a lot of my life to stay safe and make sure other people stay safe. But I just want to acknowledge why we're in the same space together. Yeah, so thank you all for joining us. Do you want to add anything before I talk about? Cool. So my name is Sean Donovan. I was just reflecting that the specific story I wanted to share with you today is just about from 20 years ago in my life. So I'm not that old, but I've lived a fair amount of years. I'm feeling my age. But I really wanted to go back to a time in my life when I was about 12 or 13. I'm about 33 now. I am 33. And it was a time in my life when I had just experienced some medical trauma that really affected my cognition. I'm not going to go into that story because it's not the point. But I was also feeling a lot of struggles with my identity, becoming an adult or becoming a young adult. And I remember a time when I was missing a lot of school. I was feeling like I couldn't make the connections to people or even to my own ideas that I once was as a younger person. I was thinking about suicide a lot at this time. And I also remember at the time like feeling really alienated from people I once felt close to, friends in the locker room and other places. I remember hearing the words like fag and gay used to mean weakness or bad. And I started to realize that like some of those words applied to me, not for being bad, but for being who I was. And so I remember ending up in a psychiatrist's office as a young adult. And I wasn't sure what I wanted to share with this person I'd never met before, but my parents had heard some of my struggle with despair and wanting to die, and they thought that was the best place to take me. So I remember risking a couple things. I told this man who I'd never met before, that I was thinking that I might be gay, but I wasn't even sure if that would be accepted and okay in this world. And I remember taking the risk to tell him that I was thinking about suicide a whole bunch recently. And I remember him not saying a word to me about my sexuality, about my identity. I remember him really fixating on this idea that I wanted to die. And he was asking questions about like, did I have a plan? Did I have the means to carry out that plan? And I wasn't even sure what these questions were getting at then. But I just sort of learned that like I should never talk about being gay at that time because people wouldn't respond. And I learned also that what was more important, that there was something wrong with me. So I remember having this interaction with this man who had power that really gave me this feeling at the time that something was wrong with me, that it wasn't that I was having, frustrations trying to come through to a new part of myself, and the world wasn't allowing that or inviting that. It was that there was something wrong in my brain, there was something wrong in my body. And so I want to come back to that, during this webinar, but I do want to say that nowadays, working for the Western Mass RLC, I have conversations about despair and suicide and meaning a lot, and they're not shut down, and they're not about risk assessment. And I'm part of communities where being gay are celebrated, being queer are celebrated, other terms that feel like they're mine now. And it really has shifted like my ability to imagine staying in this world. So I'll share more about that.
Thank you so much, Sean. And I just wanted to share one of these pictures of me and Sean is from back in the day when we could travel from Holyoke to Worcester in Central Mass. I love that picture of us in front of a dumpster. We were actually doing an alternatives to suicide training that day. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Caroline. It's great to be with N.A.P.S. It's great to be with fellow peer supporters, having worked in peer support roles now for over a decade. Like a lot of us, before I came to this work, I was a person that navigated darkness. I'm someone that has tried to end my life, spent many, many, many hours of my life thinking I can't live in this world. I can't meet the expectations that society places on me. I can't fit into the roles that I'm expected to. My feelings are too big. The fact that I hear voices that other people don't makes me too different to exist in this space. So I looked a lot of places for those answers, and certainly spent a lot of time in psychiatric facilities, trying to move through darkness. What was interesting for me was, I remember the day that I kind of realized that instead of just being, a reason to be locked in a psych ward, that potentially my voices that talked to me about ending my life had meaning. Potentially they were a call for me to radically change the life that I was living. So for me, it was really exciting to find community outside of the formal mental health system that often called me things like borderline or manipulative or psychotic. I was lucky enough to find a community called the roller derby community, where a lot of my big feelings and ways of being in the world were affirmed and celebrated. My roller derby name that was given to me by another skater. The skater's name was Scariot Tubman. Because I'm a Jewish person, she thought of a great name for me, which is Mazel-Tov Cocktail. So this also sent me on this path of exploring other identities. And I have found like all these ways of sort of making attachments to the world, even when it felt like I couldn't be there, or when I was hearing a voice that told me to end my life. So like a lot of people that become peer supporters, I was then like, oh my gosh, I want to help other people find their roller derby. I want to become a peer support specialist so I can talk to other folks about suicide and wanting to die, and re-envision ways to change our lives. This call for life to be really different or to change. So I started working as a peer specialist. But unfortunately, I quickly found out that in these roles, people didn't want me to talk about suicide. That was often framed as a clinical issue, an issue too serious for someone like myself to talk about, even though I have a lot of experience with, thinking about wanting to die. And one time in particular, I was working and I was working in a hospital, and maybe some of you have had this experience where someone shows up at the hospital that you once were in treatment with. So someone that was in a group home with me showed up. But our relationship felt so different. And I remember one day she tried to end her life by drinking poison. And I remember sitting with her and saying, like, dude, like, why couldn't we talk about this? Like, she had skated hockey and I skated derby, and we used to have all these conversations, but things felt so different. And she turned to me and she said, Caroline, the reason that I didn't tell you that I was having these thoughts is because I know things are different now. If I told you that, I know that you are supposed to contact the clinical beef-roller. I know that there's a protocol you have to follow. I know that if I had told you that I was having these thoughts, I would have stayed in this hospital longer. And the reason I wanted to die was I just didn't think I could take another day here. So this was one of the defining moments of my life. This is one of the most difficult conversations I ever had. And I realized that I wasn't really doing the type of work around the topic of suicide that was in my values. So after this incident, I actually ended up moving. I was in Asheville, North Carolina, Blue Ridge Roller Girl, and I left it all behind. And I moved 900 miles to the north, where I met my friend Sean here. And we began facilitating what's called an Alternatives to Suicide group together. And for the past 8 years, it's been really powerful to work with other folks with lived experience of suicide to figure out a new way forward, new ways to hold one another, to approach one another, to reframe the conversation around suicide and make it different than the ones we had been having. So yeah, really excited to pass along some of what we've defined and found really helpful in our community for the last decade or so.
Thank you, Caroline. Yeah, I just wanted to make a note that we are going to share a lot about this wisdom for at least the first hour, maybe a little bit longer. And then we were gonna take as many questions as we can at the end. So I just wanted to give people, I haven't looked at the chat yet, but I want to let people know where we're headed. So we have a role play in store for you too, which is partially why we're on the same screen. So just to give you a sense of what these values look like in practice. So I can remember that there was a time when I was actually in a psych ward because I expressed feelings of wanting to die. And, I got taken there by a family member. I didn't know if I wanted to stay. I shared what I had to share, and they said, if you don't stay willingly, we're going to commit you. One of those conditional voluntaries. But I'm bringing that up because it was about 10 years after I had the first interaction with a psychiatrist. And the main thing they had for me there, they wanted to know what my mental illness was. They did all these assessments, they did all these psychological evaluations, but no one really asked me like why I wanted to die. And so they missed the point about like what I was actually going through at the time. Now, thinking about our alternatives to suicide groups, I can remember a time when I did want to die and people didn't try to take over my story. People actually asked, like they validated and they said like, what's going on in your life? And that led to a very different storyline. So we're gonna talk to you about this approach where we're moving away from risk assessment. We're gonna get into like what that means. We're trying to identify the problem in the biology or the person themselves versus in the relationships. And we're gonna talk about like instead of force and coercion being in a way to address these moments, like what are some other ways? So we're gonna lead you through some ways, but first we're gonna really dive deep into like what does risk assessment look like in dialogue? What is like pathology or trying to get a diagnosis or trying to label someone as the problem themselves look like? What does force and coercion look like? So we're really gonna kind of get into the dialogue and what we want to move away from, which is what we found to be really powerful in these groups, where we can let go of that stuff, maybe even help each other heal from the things that have happened, and really try to understand like what's going on in each other's lives.
So clinical risk assessment tools around suicide have become so common that they're almost embedded like in the popular culture. So there's a lot of people that probably couldn't tell you what the Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale is, maybe never studied it in school, but they know some of the common questions that you would find on those tools, like, do you have a plan? Do you have means to carry out this plan? Are they lethal means? And so what were designed more for use in very specific settings have become embedded in our conversations about life and death kind of throughout our society. And it's become a problem in a lot of ways because clinical risk assessment tools can introduce an uncomfortable power dynamic in our conversation. So almost everyone we support, and probably ourselves, has been in a situation where, we were talking about, say, our relationship there were struggles in our relationship, and maybe financial issues with leaving an abusive partner, and talking about this difficult situation. And maybe we say, like, to a supporter, I'm thinking about, I just can't take anymore, I don't want to be here. And then suddenly the conversation shifts, and people start reading questions from off of a protocol or off of an assessment tool. So instead of the conversation now being about the relationship, which is what we're really struggling with, we're getting these questions like, do you have a plan? Are they lethal means? Do you have access to these needs? And we get so far away from the problem that we actually want to address to go on living. When we as peer specialists start to pull from these questions, it brings up all those past feelings of being dismissed or coerced up with the person we're supporting. Also, a lot of us, I know for me, I spent a lot of years in the mental health system. A lot of folks know exactly how to answer questions to either get the response they want or to avoid a response they don't want, like acute hospitalization. So risk assessment tools, we're not going to go into a lot of studies today, but are mostly ineffective at predicting who will die by suicide, just because people don't engage with them authentically. So in the alternatives to suicide approach, we're going to let go on trying to predict human behavior. Study after study indicates that people actually aren't very good at predicting behavior anyway. And putting people in different risk categories can leave folks feeling written off. So instead, our focus is going to be on exploring why a person wants to leave this world. And we've certainly had many scenarios in our groups where a person has spent days and days in and out of acute hospitals for suicide attempts or thoughts of suicide. But all that time on locked units, never once had a person been asked why they wanted to die. Not once did they actually get towards the root causes of that person's distress. So that's where we want to begin. We want to be exploring the experience.
So I mentioned briefly earlier about my story as a younger person. When I first talked to a psychiatrist, he had these magic questions that felt uncomfortable and prying. And I didn't know them by name then, but I now know them to be a risk assessment tool. These questions: do you have a plan? Do you have the means to carry it out? Are they lethal means? Like, they felt stilted, I guess, to me as a younger person, but I now don't know them that as more of a script that people are supposed to ask because of liability and because of the things that Caroline brought up earlier. And so, yeah, in our groups and in the relationships that I try to have with people, and that people hopefully try to have with me when I'm in moments of distress, like we try to like move away from that sense of control or sense of holding power over people. And I can remember some times in our groups where because people didn't go to these questions first, do you have a plan? Do you have means to carry it out? We got some pretty amazing connections from people. So and I'll get back to that in a moment, but some of the questions you might want to ask instead, even simply, do you want to talk about what's making life really hard right now? Rather than saying, do you have a plan, opening up the question, did something really painful happen recently? Kind of, that is validating that these feelings have context, and we'll get more into that too, that maybe something in the world, caused someone to want to die. Are you wanting to escape something in this world? That might be a question to leave space for the fact that something might be pursuing them that is harmful, or a person might be. Is there something you need to make life more livable? And so these are some ways of really coming from a place of curiosity. We'll get to that more But I remember a time in a group when someone was talking about wanting, this has happened multiple times actually, thinking of a bridge that they wanted to jump off of. And, you know, and so yes, there were lethal means, you know, there are everywhere. But the person was not trying to get someone to intervene. They wanted to talk about what the bridge meant for them, like going to the bridge, stepping to the bridge. I've actually done this myself in my own life. Like sometimes doing that alone or with a friend, it actually meant that people got to make the choice not to jump off the bridge. And so not coming from a risk assessment standpoint means that we start to understand, like, maybe the bridge represents more than the bridge. Maybe this is like a way to hold all the pain that's coming up for someone. And we get to have a connection around like what life and death means, rather than just trying to take control of someone's moment. We'll get more into that. So another thing I want to talk about when it comes to the alternative to suicide approach is that we actually, as especially people that are doing peer support work, we have a lot of freedom because we're not medical professionals. And I mean that in an encouraging way. Like, we don't have to assess people, we don't have to diagnose people. There's a lot of freedom in that. We get to really understand what's happening in people's lives. And so what I really love the last like 8 years or so that I've worked for the RLC, and the times that I've got to explore what it means to do peer-to-peer support, is to try to, like, I guess the word that I use is like unlearn some of the stuff that I've learned from the system. Like, maybe we can have better conversations and we can ask people, like, what does that mean to you? Like, you said you were called bipolar, like, what does that mean to you? And like asking these different questions. And so I want to address the images on the slide. So when we talk about suicide, you know, sometimes in my life in particular too, it was called a symptom of being bipolar. You know, I was given all these labels. And then when, you know, I said I was suicidal, they were like, the doctors rather were saying, well, that's because you're bipolar, and that's what bipolar people do. And so my story is getting lost. The fact that I'm actually trying to, you know, come out into the world as a gay person, as a queer person, that just gets lost. And that did for a long time for me. And the other side I want to get at is, you know, a lot of what we can do in peer support, we can have relationships where they're not based on trying to prescribe something for people, obviously. So these pills have the names of things that you cannot get from a pill necessarily. Although some pills have been good in my life, some not so good. Truth, love, hope, beauty, you know, sometimes what people are struggling with is finding these things. And so the ways that we hold each other in peer support is very different than what you would get in a clinical, you know, facility. So I wanted to get to this slide to show, you know, oftentimes like suicide is addressed as the problem. In a lot of things like suicide prevention, et cetera, like suicide is talked about as the problem. But in our approach, rather than trying to make that the problem or make the problem in the person themselves, like, we can ask about what's going on in your world. Like, a word that I use sometimes, like, what's the context? Like, what is this pain coming from? And so there are so many things that are at the roots of this suicide tree, you can call it, you know, that could be relevant to the world right now too. You know, extreme isolation in this time of COVID-19, that could be part of the root. And why is isolation hard? You know, what are we not getting from each other that we often can get? You know, being in a position of debt, student debt, you know, that feels like it's going to be part of one's life forever. You know, as I mentioned about my own story, like gender and sexuality roles, you know, not really finding a place to feel invited into the world. I know for folks who are transgender, there's a lot of studies out there, but I know this just talking to a lot of my friends, that when folks are referred to with the pronouns that they use, you know, their suicide rate isn't much different from the rest of the world. But when people are treated as if like their pronouns, their gender, their lives don't matter, their suicide rate's much higher. And so I think that there's like a correlation between, you know, how we can treat people well by being curious about their experience, not making assumptions. The last thing I want to share is that there's a whole, when you ask more questions about like what's going on in your life rather than assuming it's within the person, you might get at some storylines of like why someone wants to die. Maybe there's a lot of shame around the past sexual abuse. I know for me, there's a lot of shame in my life that there's a bigger story behind it. And so I also think, you know, some of the struggles is like that we're seeing in the world right now with poverty, with racism and how it intersects with the police. People can just feel like they don't have a place of safety or home in the world. And we've gotten at that in our groups when we've been able to ask people, you know, what is it that's going on in your life? Or what does this mean to you?
Thanks, Sean. So what are some alternatives? Just like how risk assessment protocols have become part of sort of the common language that we use with one another in our society, so has super medicalized language. So it's really common to hear people say to suffering individuals, like even in human to human conversations that I've had like with my own family, it's really common to have that first response to a person going through something in our country to be, did you take your meds today? You know, in the United States, we have more access and use more pharmaceutical products than the rest of the world combined. Certainly a lot of those are available. However, our suicide rate has been growing exponentially as well. So acting as if, you know, a pharmaceutical approach is the be all and the end all has not been successful. So what are some alternatives to, did you take your meds today? Or do you want to talk to a psychiatrist? Giving space to someone to name what they're actually feeling, what they're actually going through. A lot of the times when we say, did you take your meds today? It can send a message that we don't want to hear anymore. We want to jump to contain, that we're not willing to explore the feeling with the person beside us. And, you know, that's not a message that we want to send. We want to create an emotions positive space where we're open to big feelings. Again, in our culture, a lot of diagnostic language gets thrown around. A lot of insurance billing language is used. And that can get in the way of connection as well. So saying something like, it sounds like you're manic right now, or it sounds like you're psychotic right now. It's more like saying that the message underneath there is, I don't want to hear about your feelings, but also that they don't make sense. So most people that are in a dark space, myself included, we want to be able to name what we're feeling, and we don't want to be talked out of it. So we much more recommend, you know, validation, which we're going to talk even more about later, saying it makes sense that you're feeling angry, that you're feeling sad, that you're isolated. Also, alternatives to saying, you know, you're just like a diabetic, is asking questions that honor that our experience is fluid. So even for me, that, you know, was told that I had this lifelong mental illness that, you know, I would have my whole life. You know, I had moments in my life where things felt less heavy, and it was really powerful to explore with supporters what I was doing in those moments. That's important information. So we offer these alternatives to, you know, as peer supporters. As Sean says, we actually have a real gift to be able to go deeper and to sit with more than, you know, the general world that really quickly wants to numb something or push it away. So we don't want to unintentionally make folks feel like there's not space for them, that we just want to contain it, label it, and then move on. So what I'll say is, I've had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of conversations with people about suicide over the years, and they are very diverse. Like, the reasons that people lead people to want to end their life are complex, many more than what was just on the tree slide. And there's usually, for any one person, there's multiple. Sorry, I should have turned off my Facebook while I was doing this. I apologize. So there's a diversity in what causes people to want to end their life. But there is something that I hear a lot of. There's something I hear nearly every day, at least once a week, when supporting people who feel suicidal, which is, I haven't talked about these thoughts in months. I haven't talked about these thoughts in years. I haven't talked about these thoughts since the cops came to my door after I called the hotline. I haven't talked about these thoughts since I had to go to the hospital against my choosing. I haven't talked about these thoughts since when I went to the hospital, they took my shoelaces and my belt, and I felt ashamed. So I hear stuff like that literally every day. But what I have never heard, never even once, is someone say to me, I stopped thinking these thoughts. I stopped thinking these thoughts when I was forced to go to the hospital. I stopped thinking these thoughts when the cop showed up at my door. I stopped thinking these thoughts when someone took my shoes and my belt. No one ever says that. All people say is that they have stopped talking about them. And so we are really in favor of keeping people talking about these thoughts. And the alternatives to suicide approach, really, we want to move away from any of these types of traumatic sort of interventions that cause people to then be silent about their experience and have to hold it alone. So we're letting go of trying to control behavior because that can really backfire. We're focusing on the connection itself. And again, we're not going into the level of detail that we would with one of our longer trainings in this webinar. So we haven't included a ton of research studies, but it's important to name that globally and for many years, we see an effect where people have an elevated suicide rate post-acute hospitalization. And the more coercion involved, the higher that rate becomes. So we're really working to move away from this sort of feedback loop that people end up in of being assessed, then hospitalized until they stop saying they feel suicidal, stop saying it, probably not thinking it, but they stop saying it, and just in and out and in and out.
Yeah, and thank you, Caroline. The approach that we're talking about, the alternative to suicide approach, which we hold in the groups that we do, these alternatives to suicide peer support groups. I think of our approach as like doing something different. Like this is called a paradigm shift. Like we're moving from one model to another, but we're also helping people heal from the model they were subjected to a lot of this time, like Caroline's mentioning too. So we ask different questions and we say different things, not because like it's worked for us, not just because it's worked for us, we want to do something different, but we're also like trying to help each other heal from the ways that we've been treated when we brought up this stuff, or we thought we could trust people in the past and we couldn't. So certainly in our groups and in conversations around suicide that I'm a part of, like if I or anyone else was saying, if you're feeling this way, I need to call crisis, I would get out of that conversation right away, because I know like that is not really meeting me where I'm at that moment. That's saying that what I shared with this person, can't trust it. They can't be trusted with this. And so, like even using the words unsafe, it sounds like you're unsafe, you need to go to the hospital. I think saying for myself what safety means is one thing, but like naming safety for another person is a move of taking power over it. And so I want to get us away from that. And then just, it sounds like you're really overwhelmed. I'm going to take over now. Like that's really not where we're coming from this approach at all. We're trying to get away from that. So I just want to quickly go through some other ways you could approach this really difficult situation. So these statements are getting at probably moments where someone shared maybe some really hard to hear stuff around wanting to die. That's a lot sometimes if someone shares that with me. It's happened in the last 2 weeks for me multiple times. Not typical every 2 weeks, but and I remember what I said to this person is like, I have a limited time, though I'm so grateful you're sharing this with me. Are there other people that you trust in this way to share what you're sharing? And we had a conversation about that. Some other options are like, what do you need to get through this? Giving them a chance to pull on their own wisdom, their own experiences, or just being real. Like I'm feeling really overwhelmed by a desire to fix this situation, to like get you the help that you say is not out there, to like deal with this abuser you're talking about. But how can I best be supportive for you right now? So that really levels it back to like the moment and the relationship, and not trying to fall into like these scripts of taking control for people, which can lead to more trauma and frankly like relationships that don't continue past those points. So we are going to switch it up a little bit. We just talked, at you for quite a while, but we wanted to do a role play to get at some of these shifts. Like, what does this approach actually look like? Not just in like bullet points and our little snippets of stories, but what does this look like when we actually play it out? So we're going to do a role play for you, and then we're going to talk more about some pieces of it later. So.
Hey, Sean.
Hey.
How's it going?
I don't know. I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can do this anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you're here. I mean, I'm not gonna pump you full of questions. I'm just, if you want to hang out and share space, that's cool. But I'm open to hearing like what's going on right now.
Yeah, thanks for being here. I don't know. I feel like I have no space in my head right now. I just feel like there's so much going on. I feel like I'm saying yes to so many things to help people right now, and I'm not following through on everything right now, and I feel like I'm just heading into this place where I want to die because I'm not good enough, or I can't show up the way I need to. I don't know. It's bringing up a lot of shit for me. Like I don't feel like I'm worthy of people's. I don't feel like I'm worthy with you. I don't feel like what you have so much to do, and like I'm, I don't feel worthy right now. Like I don't even know what that word means in some sense, but like I don't feel like I deserve to be alive right now. I can't do it.
Well, I'm really glad that we can talk about this, because I hear so much of what you're saying. Like it's actually really powerful for me to like hear. What was it you said, that your head feels like really full right now? There's a lot of stuff coming in there right now.
Yeah, it's almost like it's so full of what I'm doing wrong in the present and what I'm doing wrong in the past and what I'm going to continue doing wrong in the future. And it's just like, why bother? Why suffer?
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's some shit from my past that's making me think I don't deserve to be here, because no one's really saying to me, you're fucking up. but I just feel like I am. I feel like everyone's thinking it.
Yeah.
So I don't know, like suicide just seems like it's my way out of like past, present, and future feelings of pain.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like, I don't know, for me, sometimes when expectations get really heavy, I heard you were talking about like feeling like you weren't worthy, and I guess I was curious. I mean, you were talking about the past, like have you ever got like any messages from in the past, like what makes a person worthy? I'm just curious about that.
Well, everybody's story is different and shit, but like, my parents forced me to do a lot of things, and I got to a point as a kid, like forced me to be this like classical musician and play sports and do all this stuff, and they wanted good things for me, and they provided for me in a lot of ways, and I'm grateful. But it also, when I couldn't hold that together, I felt like I was a disappointment, and that's coming back to me. And I brought that up with this other person the other day, and I said, like, I don't know if I'm worthy, and they were just like, you are worthy, and I felt so alone because I couldn't even just, I don't know, like I needed to be a mess right there, and it was like they couldn't handle that I was feeling that. So
Yeah. I really appreciate this conversation because I kind of like also got the message in my life that like if you're a worthwhile person, you're someone that's always doing shit. Like the worthwhile person is like constantly doing shit, like does it all. And like for me the pressure is like doing it all but then like never breaking down either and not being able to be a mess. And I'm curious, like, are there like any places where you can just be a mess and it feels like that you can be like who you are and like how you're feeling in that moment?
that's a good question. I think like I almost feel like I need like a physical and a social place, but I also need a mental place for that. And those aren't matching right now.
Yeah.
But I know that, I'm in a group sometimes where people talk about wanting to die, and no one tells them they should live. And I actually appreciate that because like it's more like people, they're just like letting things be. And I have been able to share about that there, but it's almost like having a space with other people, like it starts to make space in my own head. Like it doesn't come first.
Yeah.
Like I watched this show, RuPaul's Drag Race, and they always end with like, you can't love yourself. How the hell are you gonna love someone else? I fucking hate that. Because while I do love drag, not always RuPaul, like I feel like I needed people to say it's okay to share about this. And so yeah, sometimes this group's helpful, but then there's the rest of the world.
Yeah. I hear that. And that's been frustrating for me before, like to feel like I have to have myself together before I can be with people.
Yeah.
But I'll be honest, like for me, like sometimes the greatest gift for me are the people that are a mess because they give me like permission to just be who I am. Like sometimes I wonder like if we're all just trying to like do these performances, like maybe emotional drag, like be like some kind of like emotion that we don't feel and it's a performance for each other. And but if it's really like working.
Yeah, I've done that. And it's so tiring. I think that's what leads me to wanting to die a lot, actually. Yeah, appreciate you sharing that. I'm thinking, I love John Waters movies a lot, and those people are a mess in those
Yes.
movies. And not that I want to be someone like that, but I think there aren't a lot of spaces in the world that like let us celebrate that or just be in it, especially when there's like bills to pay and shit. You know, like part of the reason I'm working so hard is because I feel like I have to. And part of it is like I don't feel like I'm worthwhile if I don't. So it's tough to be in this world.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, there's this phrase I remember, I think it was on like a cross stitch from back when I grew up in Indiana. I saw this phrase once in someone's kitchen that said, "Bless this mess." But yeah, like sometimes I wonder if there's like power in that, like if there's a way to just honor the mess because it's so like human, like John Waters stuff like on the screen.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we can say this for another time when we can talk more, but like, I think it has to do with like how I think about being a man sometimes too. And I don't say that's your story, but like where I just have to keep saying yes because I'm supposed to be the strong one.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in like a self-congratulatory way at all. I just mean that it's like I'm still unraveling what it's like to be a person not caught up in what it's like to be any particular gender or a man in this case.
Yeah.
And still feel worthwhile in some way. Yeah. I don't know.
I would love to actually talk more about gender roles sometime because I don't know, like I feel like they've been choking me too. I mean, would you like to get together maybe like in a couple days and talk more about that?
Yeah, I would. I feel like there's a space in my mind right now that I can leave for that time, which feels good.
Yeah. No pressure to be perfect.
Yeah, no, that's the problem.
Yeah. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cool.
Okay, ending the role play.
Ending role play. And yeah, so I'm gonna get our slides back going again. And just so folks know, there's our Hamlet, to be or not to be, that famous first soliloquy, which is actually about suicide. So unlike productions of Hamlet, Sean and I don't practice our role plays ahead of time, so we like to do them more off the cuff. But we wanted to kind of demonstrate a different sort of conversation. There were a number of times along that like conversation's trajectory and path where, you know, I could have talked Sean out of his feelings. I could have said, no, you are worthy. Let's do some affirmations of your worthiness. Talked him out of how he was feeling, pathologized how he was feeling. You know, Sean was holding a lot of energy in his body. And, you know, there are in some settings that might be, you might ask, do you want a PRN? But when you do that, you never really get to the untold story. And there's so much that Sean was dealing with that, you know, we couldn't have explored or connected around if we'd taken these other tracks, if we'd stopped to do an assessment. So what we've talked about, what we kind of move away from in our approach. Now we're going to talk a bit more about what we are actually doing in an alternatives to suicide approach. I remember one time we have trainings of many lengths. This is a very, very quick one. Normally alternatives to suicide trainings are a couple of days or a few days long. But I remember one, we did a 3-day training and someone emailed me afterwards and was like, Caroline, I spent 3 days with you and he didn't tell me exactly what I'm supposed to say to someone who wants to die. So I felt like, you know, some people are linear. So what I did was create this acronym, VCVC. It doesn't spell anything, but what it shows is sort of, and this doesn't have to be linear, some of the points that we hit along the way in our conversations, if we're really focusing on building connection, versus trying to control another person.
Yeah, so we had mentioned this earlier, but I know that in the role play that Caroline and I just did, there was a moment where I was sharing a bit of what was going on, and Caroline said something to the extent of like, that sounds like a lot, like I'm not gonna ask you a lot of questions, or just like, I'm here for you. And even in my character, that made me feel like, okay, like I can stay here, because someone's seeing me, someone's, you know, in these words, validating that I'm a person and that what I shared, you know, is heard. So I think in our relationships with alternative to suicide approach, like this is sort of like a moment where we acknowledge that the other person and their pain is welcome here. We use a poem in our trainings called The Guest House by Rumi, which we won't have time to read, but I think about that poem a lot when I think about validation. It almost like builds the wall of this guest house, which is a place where a lot of all of the human emotions and spiritual experiences in this poem, you know, can be at once, even though it might be messy. And so validation is like, I think what really brings a relationship like into focus for the first time. So when I shared about being, you know, suicidal and having medical trauma and talking about my identity as a younger person, I'm not even sure if the psychiatrist even said like, I can see why you would feel that way, or it makes sense that you're upset. It was just more about an assessment. In our groups, I know that an act of saying, you know, like that sounds like, thank you so much for sharing that with me. That can mean so much more than saying like, well, I know what's wrong with you, okay? It's very different. But basically this whole idea of like validation gets at that we're hearing and seeing each other, you know, in this moment. We're making it okay for people to share what they're sharing. So some of the things you might say must be incredibly difficult to live in those circumstances. In our peer support groups, now that they're online, but even when they're in person, you know, a lot of people are feeling isolated. And I remember someone joining us on the online group from across the country, sharing that she hadn't, like Caroline said earlier, talked about these experiences. She was hospitalized, and other people said like, you know, I've gone through something really similar, and it just means a lot that you said that here. And it meant a lot, you know, across states for this person to hear that, or she shared that it meant a lot. So validation like makes anything that happens after this more possible. So the reason that we're talking so much about this word validation is that sometimes like in popular culture, we're fed a lot of invalidating responses, I might say. So I remember times when I've shared about like having deep despair or wanting to die, getting a lot of these responses. When I was in and out of college and I had some friends there, when I wanted to die, you know, people would say, you have so much to live for, you have that class to finish. And that didn't invite any trust in me to want to share more. That actually said like, you're trying to, you know, care for your own comfort. And this conversation, you're really not interested in what I have to share. Or even just saying, you know, that's crazy, that doesn't make sense. I think one of the hardest ones that I've heard people share a lot in our groups that I've been told as well is like, you're being selfish, which I think has a judgment in a moral kind of way. Going back to this idea of like making a conversation about pathology or someone's, you know, so-called mental illness, like, did you take your meds today? I got that one a whole bunch. And I learned to just walk away from those conversations because it didn't really feel like people wanted to know what was going on in my life. It felt like my life was reducible to one chemical or another. And that's not, humans are made up of so many chemicals, you know. and the context of why I wanted to die really mattered. So yeah, these are some examples you can read, but I'll move on.
So with validation, we're showing that we're here, we're listening, that a person's experience makes sense. And with curiosity, we're showing that we're willing to explore it with them and build a relationship with them. So I think one of the biggest mistakes that the clinical system makes is when they so closely equate talking about suicide with dying by suicide. Someone talking about suicide gets this huge response, kind of like sweep in, intervention, take control. But what we've actually found over the years is that talking about suicide can be the very opposite of dying by suicide. That people that have a regular practice of expressing and exploring thoughts of suicide are not people that end up dying by suicide. So we include a number of questions here that can really keep the conversation going. Just because we're in a dark place doesn't mean that it's that we can't explore our experience. You know, sometimes, you know, there's this question right here, how long have you felt this way? Is a really powerful one. Because I think a lot of people, myself included, like if we're honest, like thoughts of suicide are things that we've had in our life for many years. And, you know, our conversations can put our whole life in context. I love this graphic that was created by our boss, Sarah Davidow. You know, the three little words, I feel suicidal, can mean so many things. So often there's this protocol that goes into place. But a lot of times people have been sort of like forced into using the language of I feel suicidal because it's the only way that they could get people to pay attention. So at the end of those risk assessments, if they decide that you're not a risk to yourself, often you're just told, all right, now go take a bubble bath or go use a coloring book. And as human beings, we need more than that. We need space to really share our experience with others. So a lot of times, you know, someone might say, I feel suicidal, and it can mean something radically different than just, I'm thinking of killing myself. It could mean I need people to listen, or I'm having big emotions that I can't describe because maybe I've been told, I haven't been given like the vocabulary to talk about my feelings. We've talked a lot about gender. I think that's really important. A lot of folks socialized female have been told that they shouldn't be angry. A lot of folks socialized male told that they shouldn't be sad or cry. So that language of suicidal could be like one of the few things that's left for people. And even if folks are, you know, they do mean I'm thinking of ending my life, there are dozens of reasons to explore why we shouldn't have a one size fits all conversation. Because someone who's angry at all the injustice in the world might be needing like a different conversation than someone who is, you know, grieving a loss, and suicide is something that they want to do to be close to their lost loved one. So curiosity allows us to actually have the conversation that's going to be supportive.
Yeah, I was just thinking when you were reading those questions about curiosity in these contexts, like life's been hard recently. It's kind of sucked. I don't know if other people relate, but it's like I chose to share something in my story from actually more than 20 years ago, and so I how long has this been happening to me? Well, I've had suicidal thoughts since I was 12, so like 21 years, but I'm still here, and I think like I'm just reflecting on like that graphic is really amazing, and like what it makes space for is even more amazing to me. Like that we can constantly keep this in dialogue and conversation, and try to understand where each other are coming from. And I have that conversation with myself a lot too. Like, like what is this? What am I having this reaction about? So I really appreciate that frame. And so I share that in part just because it's on my mind, but I'm also sharing it because it's a bit of vulnerability about where I'm at. This is one of the things we're talking about in BC also, that in our conversations with the alternative to suicide approach and similar values, like we want people to be present in these conversations. And by present, if I'm supporting someone, I get to name my emotions too. And that's not an arbitrary ask. It's actually really important to like how we don't pull those things about coercion and force and other things into these conversations where it doesn't belong. So in conversations where I'm supporting someone that's suicidal or talking about wanting to die or in deep despair, maybe being angry at what's happening to them in the world, like a way that I can be vulnerable is share some of my own experience. Like I felt really angry at the world too sometimes, and it's made me want to end my life. Like when people, told me, that I should lower my expectations of myself because of something they thought was going on in my brain or whatever it is, like a diagnosis. I think that's really powerful. Like don't leave someone there alone in the moment. If you have something to share that could be similar and related. But also sometimes in these conversations, I know when I've shared some real desires to die, like it almost felt like I could see people's eyes glazing over and like thinking about who they're going to call while they're not really sharing what's going on in their mind. And I really want to encourage folks in this webinar to think about not doing that. So I've had moments where even recently where I felt so overwhelmed with what I was hearing, where someone maybe had pills in their hands and I was on the phone with them, that, I just owned it. I said like, hey, it's really hard to hear that you're thinking about taking these pills and you're on the phone with me right now. I would feel really sad if you weren't here, but I want to listen. That's why I'm here. And so just owning something rather than acting from it, owning your fear rather than acting from your fear. And I've seen that really be helpful in my relationships when we're talking about despair. I also, I've known that, kind of in the role play we did, I was playing this character that just said yes to everything. That can get really messy in relationships when we're trying to be vulnerable. And so I want to draw attention to that. There have been times when I've talked to people about feeling in distress and people have said something like, well, call me anytime, or like, I'm always here for you. And then I tried calling and like, they didn't pick up. And like, maybe that's because they were sleeping, maybe other things, but like, I guess own the fact that you have limitations too, like that's okay. But be open and honest about it with the person you're supporting if you're in that role. So you could say something like, I want to be supportive, but I need to leave in half an hour. Like I have to pick up my kid or attend to something else. Is there another person you trust to talk about this with? So I definitely, that has opened up ways to be more transparent with people. It's another word I guess we use sometimes. Just to like say, like, to own that you have limitations. It's okay to be a human being with limitations, but don't hide those from people and then end up taking control away from someone in the process.
Thanks, Sean. And so our final C here is community. So there is a tendency in our wider culture to say, oh, if a person's suicidal, they need to be out of their community. For example, hospitalized, or the idea that suicide or these deeper issues these should only be talked about in like a therapist's office for 1 hour a week. So there's sort of this removing from the community that we see. However, we've seen that really backfire. Suicide, you know, most of the time is a very solitary and disconnected act. So for me, you know, one of the things that kept me alive was to be sort of like woven in to different communities, have places where I had a role, where I had a purpose, where there was some reason why I was staying alive, other than just to make sure my case manager didn't get like a review, an ethics review. We need reasons, we need community, we are human. And I'll just share a brief story from one of the groups where we were both in this group and someone came to the group, someone that was struggling with the desire to hang herself. And she was like, I've tried this drug and it didn't work. I've tried this drug and it didn't work. I want to try ketamine. I want to try MDMA. I want to try magnets. I want to do this. And I remember you asking her, Sean, you know, first validated the woman and said, that sounds like really frustrating to have tried all those things and they didn't work. But then Sean came from a place of curiosity and said, you know, I'm just curious, like, how would you know they were working? Like, how do you want to feel? And I don't think this person had ever been asked that question, like, ever in her life. And so I was kind of like waiting, like, to see how she would respond, like how she wanted to feel. And I never forgot what she said, because she didn't say, I don't want to feel sad. And she didn't say, I want to feel happy all the time. What she said was, I want to feel like I can walk into a room and I belong there. And embedded in that was just like, no matter how I feel, even if I am like a mess that day, I want to feel part of a community, where I am accepted, as I am, no matter what emotional state I'm in. So when we use the alternatives to suicide approach, you know, we keep an eye to community. This is way easier in alternatives to suicide groups, yes, because there's already a group there, and a lot of times the group will do things together, like go to drag shows or punk shows or just out for tea or coffee. But in our one-on-one conversations using this approach, we also keep an eye to community too. So like asking someone, you know, are there ever times when you don't feel like dying? Yesterday I was facilitating a support group where someone was hearing voices constantly telling him to kill himself. And what we talked about was, you know, how sometimes we can tell our voices, I'm not going to kill myself, but I promise you I will change something about my life. And so we asked this person, is there anything you want to change about your life? This was a young person. And he said that he wanted to start lifting weights. So we spent time talking about, he asked me how much I could lift. I was honest, I cannot lift very much, though I can squat. I used to be able to squat my own weight. And so we would talk, we spent some time just exploring like stuff like that. So it's really important to keep in mind, just because we're talking about suicide, we don't want to narrow our conversation down. Conversations about suicide, to be really effective and to move through them or create space around them, we want to be thinking about like this entire community. So what we're gonna do now, we're gonna leave some more examples up there of VC statements that pop up as we're using this approach in our conversations. And we know there's been a lot going on in the chat box. We have not been able to follow any of it. So we're gonna rely on Martha to help us with those questions, or I think there's questions. We're hoping it's not just all comments that say, you guys suck.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Sean. Most of the comments are, this is amazing, great, they love the role play. There are a couple of questions, and I encourage other people to put questions there now. One is, have you had any good experiences in trying to teach traditionally trained clinicians this way of helping people?
Yeah, I want to answer that in two ways. First of all, like sometimes people that are traditionally trained come to our groups for support. Like, I mean, I'm not naming any names, of course, but like people that are clinicians, social workers, sometimes themselves need support because they are suicidal and their practice does not help them, and neither do their colleagues. But yeah, we also, so like Caroline mentioned, we do, and there's more we can say about that, but we don't have a lot of time. There are trainings that we do that get at facilitators for alternatives to suicide groups, which is people who are have been through the experience of suicide attempts or deal with suicidal thoughts, and they're willing to be open about that. We also do another training coming from the same ideas called When Conversation Turns to Suicide, and also similar trainings where we invite anyone to come that wants to shift these values in conversation. So sometimes we do have like clinicians, social workers, Miria, not really psychiatrists as much. I don't know.
I think we've had a couple, but they're rare.
But yeah, those have been really wild trainings to have like a wide range of people, including family members of folks that struggle, including peer support folks. Like we include everyone in those trainings, and those have been hard sometimes because sometimes the reasons for people coming to the trainings are very different. But what's been really cool about that is we have a wide range of like worldviews, I guess, that people can share and we can kind of move through together. So we have had some success in our local area having people come to those trainings. We've also done some consultation for different organizations, like if they have a policy that says, like you have to follow this, like some organizations are like, that hasn't been working for us. So can we do something different in our policy? So we've had some success with some more like community-based organizations, just like from the top down, shifting how they approach is practiced.
Yeah, I think a lot of clinicians, they get it. And in our longer trainings, there's more research studies, which, clinical roles appreciate those, but so do people in peer roles I've seen. I think the trickier piece can be vulnerability with clinicians. We would really like to see more vulnerability from clinicians. I work in peer roles, have for many years. But I don't want us to have like all the market share of vulnerability. I think it's going to be really important for more clinicians to break down that binary between sick and well, helper and helped. I would like to see more of that. So sometimes with that second B there, it's trickier, but really worthwhile, because I think the reason why we see clinicians that are quite suicidal themselves is this expectation that they wear this mask all the time. That's very, like in the metaphorical sense, some of us are wearing masks right now, but like not show any of themselves. I think that can hurt connections and also hurt them too.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions that address sort of liability, either from a nonprofit board that has fears about liability, or or the myth of liability for clinicians. Could you speak to that?
Sure. I mean, when we do a longer training, we spend a lot of time around liability, and we've had the benefits of attorneys that have worked with us, like Susan Steffen, that have taken a close look at American case law. Fears of liability, like being held civilly liable in the event of a suicide, are actually very rare in the mental health system. So if you look at case law, the risk of a non-prescribing outpatient clinician being held liable for a death by suicide is about the same as being struck by lightning. So it is very rare that these cases are brought, and certainly rare that they are won. It is psychiatrists prescribing black box medications that have that more elevated risk. And certainly there isn't much of a case law around peer support groups. There's never been a case brought where, like, an alternatives to suicide group, where someone tried to hold them liable for someone's death by suicide. What I'll say though is that deaths by suicide are shockingly rare amongst people who attend the groups. That's why we say having this practice of talking openly, exploring thoughts of suicide is so important, is because when I worked in peer roles before, like down in North Carolina, we lost a lot more people this way.
All right.
I'll add one more thing, and that's like about different states have different laws around this, and we don't have time to go into different states, but like what gets called mandated reporting in Massachusetts, like sometimes like that phrase gets used by organizations to say like this is the law, when it's actually like organizational policy. So like I mentioned, we worked with like an organization to like rewrite their policy. Sometimes people are calling something a law which isn't. And I think it's really good to do some investigation in your own state. And for that board member, like look at like, is it organizational policies that you're running against, or is it something above you, like a state policy? Because when we can say it's organizational, we can work through that much more easily and like make space for these conversations that are so valuable, versus if you have to change like policy. So that's just one added point.
Thank you for bringing that up, Sean. And I would encourage you in your state to actually look at the laws, because as far as I know, it is not part of mandated reporter law.
Right.
There's another questions that can kind of come together about, as peer supporters, do you feel an ethical responsibility to keep someone from ending their lives? And to tack on to that, when someone shares an active suicide plan and does not find support in VC, is there further intervention provided? Is that too much, or?
It might be good to separate them out. So what was the first question?
The first is, do you feel an ethical obligation to keep someone from ending their life?
So I guess deeper than that is, beyond ethics, is, do I have the ability? I think there's a question before that question, which is, do I actually have the capability of keeping a person from ending their life? I would argue that probably not. Certainly a lot of the interventions that get utilized, like we know that acute hospitalization is not an evidence-based approach for reducing rates of suicide. We know that suicide rates tend to increase. So I think the first question is, can I do this? Or do efforts to control ultimately fail and also backfire? So I guess where I begin with that is, I don't have that ability. So what ethically is important to me is to do my role, which is building relationship, deep listening, willing to explore, being vulnerable, and realize these are incredible gifts that we offer as peer specialist that is so rare in our society at large. So I want to do these important parts of my job that I know are helpful and meaningful. Focus on that.
Yeah, I had one small thing, which is on a different level. It's on a level of relationships, like one-to-one. Like there's some people, and they're friends of mine that I've known for years that go through moments of wanting to die like I do. And we have conversations about, like, if you text me and you say you're about to take pills, like, what do you want? What do you want from me? So I feel like we're not trying to reproduce making assumptions and coercing people in this approach. And then frankly, in my life with friends, but I really want to understand, like, what is someone expecting of me? Like, maybe what they expect of me is not what I'm able to give, like ethically or in my own power, like Caroline said. And so that's been really important to me. I know someone who goes through this a lot, and they want nothing of the police or crisis services involved, because that's landed them with a lot more trauma to have to live with after that. And so, you know, we have an understanding, which we've agreed to, that like if they text me, like I validate, I can ask questions, but I'm not to call that. And that actually, for me, that allows us to have a friendship where, in fact, like I might have just been this person that our friendship would have broken down a long time ago. So they're still alive. And I'm not saying like that's always going to be the case, but it was meaningful to really like check in individually with this person, for instance.
Yeah, I love that question of why. And I think this kind of flows into the second question, but I sort of lost some of it. But yeah, if someone is coming to me, normally like suicide, we've been talking about how it's this very solitary act. So if someone has reached out to me and is saying, Caroline, I'm calling you because I'm going to die right now, I might come from a place of curiosity and say like, wow, that's a lot. And I'm just curious, you could have just killed yourself, but instead you chose to reach out. And I'm wondering about that. Like, I'm wondering why, like, did you reach out because, you're looking for another way forward? Like, how would you like me to respond? Because again, like some people like have been written off so much that, the system has kind of said, you have to say these things, or you have to be this extreme for your pain to matter. And we're trying to create a world where your pain matters, period. It matters, and I'm here to listen to you, not assess you. So asking like what, even like in a big, like extreme moment, like what a person needs, we don't throw that away. Curiosity has been really helpful for us.
Thank you. And that did get into that question about if, someone says they have a plan, is there further intervention?
Yeah, I mean, I would ask more, like, what are you looking for? What, is there something that's happened that's really solidified your plan? Is there like a lot of urgency right now? And just make space for the conversation. Because again, like we could drop everything and act. But what we've seen is that a lot of the things that end up happening, will later lead to the person not sharing about the experience anymore. So our preference is to really stay in dialogue.
And I want to say one more thing, and that's like, you said this earlier, Caroline, I want to bring it back, is like, if someone's saying this to you, unless they're saying like, I am acting right now, like that's not what's happening most of the time in conversations I'm having, like they're saying it to you. So don't confuse that with an act. But more importantly, also, I think just like focus on like, thank you for sharing that and validate that shit. This is hard for me, but like, I'm wondering, what do you want from me right now? I want to be the best person for you or whatever, like focus on why is that person even sharing that? in that moment. Be curious about that.
Can we also share the slide that you made? Because I feel like it kind of like, we're talking about like dialogue and exploration, but you know, maybe you have run out of time. Like maybe you have to go pick up your kid or feed your cat, or you have like another Zoom appointment with someone else. So do you want to share like this piece?
Yeah, so earlier Caroline said like VCBC, it's a linear way to remember these things, but it's not always practiced in a linear way, like one-to-one to one-to-one. So this is a statement that kind of gets at all these values in one statement. So, you know, I'm really grateful you shared this with me, and this is also hard for me to hold alone with you, or maybe I have to be somewhere really soon. It's really important. Are there any other supports or people in your life you might also share these thoughts with too, or that you feel trusting of these thoughts? And so that might be a way, instead of, you know, like we said earlier, like calling crisis or doing something more brash and out of the values of this, to really get at like your needs, your emotions, this person's needs, their emotions, and how to like imagine the way forward. I realize we're a little past 2:30. I know Caroline and I said we could stay a little bit longer, maybe like 10 minutes or so, but.
Well, maybe just a few. It is my wedding anniversary today. I've been married 3 years, and I love talking about suicide. I really do. I married my husband because we can talk about suicide together. So I might transition from talking to y'all to talking to him shortly. But we could take like maybe 1 or 2 more.
So please, if you want to stay, if you have a question, please do. I put several links if you want to know more about this or the online supports going on right now. Please visit westernmassrlc.org website. You'll find trainings for alternatives to suicide. You'll also find ongoing virtual groups for alternatives to suicide. So let's see here. We have. Thought there was a question. How do you approach clinicians if you're working together to support someone and their approach is different?
Yeah, so I think it depends on what roles we're in here, I guess. But like, I try not to work with clinicians unless I'm first working with, you know, I try not to be in the presence of a clinician talking about someone behind their back unless the person wants me in that meeting. So I feel like it's, I want to just say, as people doing peer support, like we should be holding, you know, the choices of the person who's struggling or who's, you know, above all else. Like, so sometimes I will be in meetings with a clinician, but it will be with that person. So I'm not sure if that question is asking something that I'm not understanding. But what I will say is that it can be really hard if someone is being supported by someone holding these values and also someone who's not holding these values outside of that. I still see a counselor on occasion who's like an advanced practice psychiatric nurse, and I will tell you that I love her in a lot of ways because she's also like a yoga instructor. We get a lot out of each other, but I've learned that I just don't say certain things to her. I don't talk about suicide with her because she can't hold that. And so I've learned that like I get that support elsewhere, which I'm grateful to have. But I know that like sometimes I take people for what they can give to me in these roles and what they can't. But I'm not sure if you wanted to share.
Yeah, I mean, having worked amongst clinicians, you can use VCVC too. They like a lot of validation as well, clinicians. So what I often do is like just validate that their role is very important. But you know, as a peer specialist, that I hold different values. And so it's nice when you can take, you know, we have trainings, and then when you take the training, like you get a whole manual on this stuff instead of just like one, you know, PowerPoint. But I find clinicians are amenable when you can like articulate, this is what I'm doing, and I'm doing it because my role is a different discipline than yours. So just like there are psychiatrists that approach things like one way, you know, a social worker maybe another. In peer roles, there's simply different goals and tools that we utilize in our role. And it's not a value judgment to say one is better or worse, but they are different. And what we found in working with clinicians, like the big fear I've seen amongst clinicians is that a person might be really struggling and then not have support. So you can always say, you know, if you're working on a team with clinicians, like you can say to the person, kind of like what's on this slide, you know, this is hard for me to hold alone. I'm wondering who we could reach out to together, who on this community support team, or who on this unit, or who on the ACT team, you know, you would feel comfortable sharing about what you're going through right now. And it might not be like the suicide, but it might be the problem that's actually driving the person to want to die. Because remember, as Sean said, like way earlier in this webinar, suicide itself is not the problem. Suicide is a solution. Now it's one that a desperate solution that we don't want people to take, but it's never like the problem itself. So figuring out what that actually is, what the heaviness is, and then connecting the person to someone else that they feel comfortable sharing that with. So if there's one more question, we can take one more, and then we must be on our way.
I
Did
don't
we hit them all?
I think we got most of them. I think one thing, the question about would you do something else, you know, like say you're supporting someone and they say, I really think I want to go to the hospital now. What would you do?
Honor that.
Yeah, we've gone with people to the hospital. Like we're not here to make choices for people, but what we are here to do is support people to get to where they want to be within their own limitations. So I'll say, like, I've gone from a conversation after an alternative to suicide group where someone left the group still really in that place of wanting to die, but wanting support through that. And I went to the emergency room with them because that's where they wanted to be. Granted, I had stuff to do in an hour, so I said, I can be with you here for this time. Is there someone else I could contact that they could, you know, come and support you? Also, I know being in the emergency room when people are struggling this way, it can take days. So yeah, I think we honor people's desires. I have said to people, you know, like before we go, like, why do you want to be there? Like, is there something that you can get from the hospital that you can't get from the greater world? Because I know I've been there thinking I needed to go there, and I realized I had it already among the people in my life. But some people say, you know, like, I haven't eaten through 2 weeks and I need a place where they're going to be feeding me, and I can't afford to go to like a spiritual retreat or like a yoga retreat where they feed me good food. And you know, someone might say, no, I need to be in a place where I'm contained. Sometimes people said I need to just be like seen by people. And so sometimes we can be like, is there any way you can find that outside of the hospital? I know you've had tough experiences inpatient. And then we might think of other ways, but we honor people's choices. But I also am curious about, like, you know, what the choices come from.
Thanks, everybody. We hope that this has been helpful for you. And, you know, we're wishing everybody, you know, strength and solidarity during this time of global pandemic. It's a tough time to be in the roles that we're in. And so, yeah, wishing everyone solidarity, and hope that you can find some faith for the things that give you life, along with doing this important connection, exploration, and work.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Sean. I think this was a great webinar, and if anyone's interested, it will take me probably till the weekend, but the video and the slides will be posted on the N.A.P.S website under the webinars tab. Again, I'd encourage you, for a lot of these questions about training or groups or whatever, visit westernmassrlc.org. And I think that is it.
Thank you, Martha.
Thanks, Martha. Thanks, N.A.P.S. We'll see you folks later.